Hi, my name is Chris Melnick and I'm a realtor in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Today I'm going to go over how an agreement of purchase and sale is written. This is also known as an offer. This is what contains the price, terms, and timeline. To make this easier to understand, I'll go over a sample timeline first. This will help put some context in my explanation of the agreement of purchase and sale. So to begin, we have an offer date. That's when we're going to be writing and potentially submitting the offer. And then we have a closing date known as possession. Now, we would pick this closing date based on what works for us and what works for the seller, and sometimes meet somewhere in between. The first thing we need to figure out is, when can our expected acceptance be? And by this, I mean, even if the sellers did want to accept our offer, how quickly can they get back to us? Sometimes sellers can do it in a few hours. Sometimes they're out of country. They need about 2 days or so. But it makes a big difference for us because on the bottom of this agreement of purchase and sale, it also has a section where we mention how long this offer is able to be kept open or able to be open for the sellers to accept it. So if they really need 2 days because they're physically out of the country and unavailable, or could be in the Amazon, they don't have access to a phone. If we only give them 3 hours, there's no point because after 3 hours, the offer's void. So that needs to be incorporated into the offer, how long they actually need to take to respond. The next thing we need to know is if we need anything from the sellers to meet and satisfy our conditions. And by that, I mean, if we'll have a number of conditions. Common ones are, say, financing and home inspection. So if we have financing as a condition, one thing that the vast majority of mortgage brokers, mortgage professionals need is the most recent property tax bill. Now, this is such a common requirement that most listing agents will just include this in the files associated with that listing. A lot of the times, that finance person can't get started until they have this property tax bill. So if it's not there, if it's not in those files attached to the listing, we need it. And we typically have to give about like a day or so. They realistically should have this on hand because anyone who's representing a buyer that needs a mortgage, they are going to need this. And that's the vast majority of buyers. So that's something else we have to incorporate into our offer, because if it delays us a day, then we need to know that. And next, the expected financing approval. So this is really just figuring out where the bottleneck is going to be. Because as I mentioned before, if we have financing and home inspection as conditions, and then there's also realistically a lawyer review in there, which is, it's effectively a condition just in a different section. Then we have to figure out where the bottleneck or where the constriction is. Now, it used to be the case where for lenders, mortgage brokers, they need about 2 to 7 business days somewhere in there to actually approve the loan. And that's normally the constraint. Because realistically, if you're also looking for a home inspector, home inspectors can be booked with relatively short notice if you just know the right people. So that's typically not a constraint. But if they say we need 5 business days, I need to put the expected financing approval date 5 business days after the seller's obligations, after I expect to receive that property tax bill. Then I'll know when I should be able to get financing approval. And then in general, if we have a bit of room, like if we don't have to be incredibly competitive, I'll put an extra day or so between the day I expect to get financing approval and then the firm date. So the firm date is basically the done deal date. So that's deal's done, it's in stone. So this is when all the conditions would be due. This is also when I have the lawyer review due. And this is usually when I have the deposit due. I just coincidentally make them all on this same day, the firm day, just to keep things simple. And then from there, I can work back. And as I mentioned before, the home inspection, it's not a real constraint. I can usually book it with relatively short notice, and I put it towards the firm date though. Notice if we have a day in between the expected financing approval and the firm date, I'd maybe put the home inspection just the day before expected financing approval. Here's the reason why. Home inspectors, they'll give you their answers, whether what they think of the home that day that they're there or the next morning. So the lead time on their decision, on their review, I should say, is very, very short. So if you were to have the home inspection right after you got the offer accepted, then you'd be spending that money in between, $450 or $650 on that home inspection. And then maybe a few days later, if the bank doesn't approve the mortgage, then you're out that money for a home inspection. It's gone. But either way, that's why I push the home inspection towards the end, just as risk mitigation, because it doesn't cost us any money to send all the documents out to the lenders, to the lawyers, but it costs money for the home inspection. That could just be lost money. So here's just approximately what it could look like. So between a day between the offer date and the expected acceptance, and then a day between the expected acceptance and the seller's obligations. And again, if they have everything good to go, we don't even have to allow that day. So we can make our offer even shorter. Then we need 5 days between the seller's obligation, so getting that property tax bill, and then the expected financing approval. And there's a bit of a caveat here because that's 5 business days. So in reality, we'd be tacking on another 2 days because the lenders don't work on weekends. And the lawyers, they can do things pretty darn quick, at least in terms of reviewing documents. So if we were to give them everything on our acceptance day, we would have it well before even the home inspection usually. And then between the financing approval firm date, give us a day, just call it wiggle room. If we have to be very competitive, just make it tight, 0 days. If we want to be a bit more flexible, do 2 days or so. And then in between firm date and closing date, that's basically just subtraction. When was our firm date? When was our closing date? And these are the remaining days. So a normal period of time between a firm date and a closing date, if it's owner occupied, is maybe a month and a half to 2.5 months. Somewhere in there is probably normal. Hopefully, going over the timeline helped you understand how we plan the dates and the order of events. With that in mind, now we'll actually look over the agreement of purchase and sale. This is the agreement of purchase and sale. If you're wondering, these different boxes correspond to additional schedules that could be added to this agreement if they were applicable. For example, if it was a condo, then you would add the 1-page resale condominium schedule. If it's on a well and septic, you would add the well and septic schedule. Same with equipment. And then over here, you would just total the amount of pages. So this agreement of purchase and sale is 3 pages. If you had water and septic schedule, which is 1, and resale condominium schedule, which is 2, that would be 5 pages. Here, this is straightforward. Buyer's name, where they're from. This can be just address or even city. Seller's information. Information on the property, the PID. Here is the most important section of the agreement of purchase and sale, the purchase price. Section 1, deposit. This is the deposit amount to submit on this day. As mentioned in my timeline, I like to coordinate things such that on one day is the condition removal day. It's also when the deposit is due, also when lawyer review is due. And that just makes everything a lot easier to keep track of. Now, the deposit is payable to the listing agent's brokerage typically. In certain cases, it can be payable to a lawyer, but most cases it's the listing agent's brokerage. Here we are. Here's closings. This is another key part of this agreement. So this is the closing date, also known as possession. Here's section 2.2. This is at what time on this day the property has to be clean and vacant and ready for the pre-closing viewing or the closing inspection. Now, what I've started doing is instead of the morning of, which is pretty typical, I'll either try to push for the night before or even the afternoon before, just to give us more time. On this section, conveyance of the property subject to the agreement shall be home by warranty. Yes, it's typically a warranty deed. In certain cases, if it's an estate sale or a repossession, it can be a different type of deed, but typically it's warranty. Seller's obligation. So as mentioned in the timeline, to fulfill your conditions, which are down here, if you require information to fulfill these conditions, then you're going to list that up here. So in my timeline example, I mentioned that if you needed, say, property tax, because it's not listed here, you would just write it in this box. But for example, if the listing said they had a property disclosure statement or the listing said they had an equipment schedule, but they never provided it, then you're going to be requesting them here. And you'll give them a day or so to provide these documents. Now, moving down, buyer's conditions. So these, of course, are all the conditions that you have to be satisfied with before you agree to actually buy the home. And anything that you mentioned up here, meaning that you needed these to satisfy conditions, you, of course, have to then check them off down here. So if you said you needed the property disclosure statement and equipment schedule from the seller, then of course you need to be satisfied by those agreements. As well, the normal or typical ones are financing and property inspection. As a default, I basically just check this one off just to give my clients a bit more peace of mind. And if you're getting a mortgage, you have to have insurance for it. If you can't get insurance, then you can't get the mortgage, because if the house burns down, the bank still wants to be able to recoup their money. Here, so this is the time that you'd have to be able to send that form 408, which is the condition removal form, on this day. So typically I'll put this as 11:59 p.m. So the stroke before midnight on that day, just to give my buyers as much time as possible. That being said, a lot of listing agents don't like that to be close to midnight because they don't want the possibility of having to do paperwork that late. So they'll ask for 7 p.m. or 9 p.m., something along those lines. Tax. Now, if it's just a resale house, you're not going to have tax and it's just going to be exempt from tax. But if it's new construction, there will be tax, but all new construction is listed such that tax is included. This one, subject to HST included in the purchase price. So that's going to be new construction. So the price you see listed, that's the price you're paying, and HST is just taken out of that. In certain cases, though, if it's a half residential, half commercial, it can be subject to HST. Or if it's just a commercial, it'll be subject to HST. If it's brand new land, like recently subdivided land, it'll be subject to HST. And if it's resale land, it'll be exempt from HST. Fixtures and chattels. So a fixture is something that's bolted or attached to the home. And that's basically a given that it comes with the home. But a chattel, on the other hand, that's movable. There can be gray areas whether or not they are included. For example, a chattel would be like a couch or a freestanding TV or a dining room table set. But then there's other ones like curtains and blinds and hanging mirrors, and certain things can be unclear. Here it lists the day when you viewed the property. So this agreement is based on all the fixtures that you saw when you viewed the property. That's included with the home. And then the chattels that you'll mention in the next section, all of those referenced in the next section that you saw during this day, they'd also be included. So here they are. So these could have been considered gray areas because
a fridge, washer, dryer, these are all movable. Strictly speaking, a dishwasher is built in, so it would come automatically. But it's always good. If you're ever unsure, if there's ever a gray area, just write it in, because you don't want to assume something and then it not being there during the closing walkthrough. Oftentimes, I'll also put in there above vanity bathroom mirrors and also all window coverings and hardware. Those two can be gray areas, and I know my buyers want those. Lawyer review. So as mentioned before, I like to plan the satisfaction to lawyer review condition date the same day as the buyer's condition satisfaction date, and be it the same day as the deposit, just to make things very easy. Property migration. This one, again, it's more of a formality, but properties haven't been resaled after about 2006 or built after about 2006. They just weren't in a special property database. So if it's not, it just takes the seller a bit more time, but if it's a longer closing, then it's not actually going to affect you. Agency relationship. So this just notes that the seller has a relationship with a brokerage and a specific realtor. And then this section, of course, is just that the buyer has an agency relationship with me. Time for seller's response. So this is what I had talked about early on my timeline, where we had expected acceptance. So we have down here, the offer shall be open for acceptance until, and I mean, at the end of the day, name of the game is to have as short of time as possible. So you want to give the seller as limited amount of time as reasonably possible, because if you were to give them like 2 weeks to respond to an offer, well, they could just wait and be shopping around and see if anyone else wants it, if anyone else could get a better price. So you want to do this as a short amount of time as possible, but it has to be reasonable. So if you can find out how quickly the seller is able to move, then you can put that in there. Those are the key parts. If you have more questions, feel free to pause the video and actually read the sections. Aside from that, it's pretty standard. All deals that are done, all the standard sections are in place, and all the blanks are just filled in.
And that's the agreement to purchase and sale. Hopefully this video helped you understand how these are written so it doesn't come completely as a surprise when you need to sign one. If you'd like to contact me, my information is in the description. Goodbye.